The handcuffs clicked around my son's wrists with a finality that stopped my heart. 12 years old, in custody, for riding a bicycle. Sheriff Sheila towered over him, her shadow stretching across the sidewalk where his bike lay toppled. My boy's eyes found mine through the gathering crowd, wide, terrified, pleading. I pushed forward, my voice strangled in my throat. "He is just a child," I managed to say. "What possible crime could he have committed?" Sheriff Sheila turned to me with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Her badge caught the afternoon sunlight, a mocking gleam of authority unchecked. "Reckless endangerment, resisting an officer, disturbing the peace," she recited, as if reading a shopping list rather than destroying a child's sense of safety. "You might want to teach your son about respecting law enforcement before he ends up somewhere worse than the backseat of my cruiser." That was when I noticed the small plastic bag being slipped into my son's backpack by her deputy. Something white, something planted, something that would change our lives forever. And that was the moment I decided, if this was how Sheriff Sheila enforced the law, I would become justice itself. Freedom has different meanings depending on who you ask. For some, it means voting rights or the ability to speak without censorship. For others, it might be financial independence or religious expression. But for my son, Daniel, freedom was simpler. It was the feeling of wind rushing past his face as he pedaled through our quiet streets, the satisfying crunch of gravel beneath rubber tires, and the independence of exploring our small town on his own terms. I am Thomas Mitchell, a single father raising my 12-year-old son in the rural community of Pinewood, a town so small it boasts exactly one traffic light and 3 churches. After my wife passed away 4 years ago, it has been just Daniel and me, figuring out life one day at a time in our modest rental on Elm Street. I work as an accountant at the local credit union, nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills and allows me to be home when Daniel returns from school. Daniel received his blue Schwinn bicycle for his 10th birthday. It was not new or expensive, but I had spent weeks restoring it from a yard sale find, repainting it his favorite color and replacing worn parts. To him, that bicycle was more valuable than any video game console or smartphone his classmates might have owned. It represented autonomy, the first real taste of growing up. Every afternoon after school, Daniel would complete his homework at the kitchen table, then ask the same question, "Dad, can I go for a ride?" And every afternoon I would give him the same answer, "Be back before the streetlights come on." It was our ritual, as consistent as sunrise. On that particular Tuesday in April, nothing seemed different. Daniel left with a wave and that familiar look of excitement. The routes he took were well established down Maple Avenue, past the community center, through Veterans Park, and sometimes along the edge of Main Street where he could see the older teenagers hanging out at the diner. Occasionally, he ventured down the alleyway behind the municipal buildings to reach the library faster. It was a routine as innocent as childhood itself. When the front door slammed 3 hours later, I expected to see him flushed with exercise and ready for dinner. Instead, I found my son standing in our entryway, his face drained of color, eyes downcast. The confident posture that had carried him out the door had vanished. "What happened, buddy?" I asked, immediately setting aside the bills I had been reviewing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his fingers still gripping his handlebars though he stood inside our house. "A police officer stopped me today." My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice casual. "Oh, were you speeding?" I attempted humor to ease whatever tension had followed him home. He did not smile. "The lady sheriff, she said I was riding recklessly through the alley behind the police station." "Sheriff Sheila Blackwood," I clarified, knowing well our town's recently elected top law enforcement official. She had run on a platform of restoring order to our supposedly crime-ridden streets, though most residents struggled to remember the last serious incident in Pinewood. Daniel nodded. She came out of the building while I was cutting through to get to the library faster. She yelled at me to stop, and when I did, she said I could have hit someone or something. But Dad, I was going slow, and there was nobody else there. I sat down at his eye level, searching his face. Did she write you a ticket or anything? No, she just told me to be more careful and that the alley wasn't a bike path. She said next time there would be consequences. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. Hey, it was probably just a misunderstanding. Maybe she was having a bad day. You know how adults can be sometimes. I offered him a reassuring smile. Just be extra careful around the municipal buildings, okay? No harm done. Daniel nodded, but the tension did not leave his small frame. He wheeled his bike to the garage with none of his usual enthusiasm. That night at dinner, he pushed his spaghetti around his plate instead of devouring it as usual. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a routine interaction between an officer concerned about safety and a young boy who might have been riding too quickly. But something about the look in Daniel's eyes suggested this was more than a casual warning. There was fear there, and perhaps something worse. The first cracks in his childhood belief that adults in authority were always fair and just. I did not know then how prophetic that uneasiness would prove to be. I could not have imagined that this minor incident was merely the first drop in what would become a storm of injustice. But deep down, something about my son's changed demeanor told me this was not just a one-time thing. And I was right. The following week passed with a semblance of normalcy. Daniel gradually resumed his after-school rides, though I noticed he mentioned the library less frequently. On Friday afternoon, I was preparing dinner when the front door burst open with such force that a framed photograph fell from the wall. Daniel stood in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper in his trembling hand, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted the entire way home. She stopped me again, he gasped, thrusting the paper toward me. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and took what appeared to be an official warning notice from the Pinewood Sheriff's Department. The word loitering was circled in bold red ink, with Daniel's name printed neatly in the offender field. The location cited was County Municipal Plaza, North Side. What happened? I asked, struggling to keep my voice level as I examined the document. Daniel collapsed onto a kitchen chair. I was just riding past the courthouse. Not even in the alley this time, Dad. I was on the main sidewalk. His voice shook. Sheriff Sheila pulled up beside me in her cruiser and told me to stop. She said I had been seen in the area too many times and it constituted loitering. Did you stop riding when she asked? I questioned, knowing my son had always been taught to respect authority figures. Yes, sir, right away. Daniel's eyes welled with tears. She got out and stood really close to me. She asked where I lived and said she had warned me about causing disturbances. Then she wrote that and told me next time she would confiscate my bike for public safety. I read the warning notice again, my initial confusion giving way to indignation. The paper cited repeated suspicious presence in restricted areas and refusal to comply with verbal warnings. Neither accusation aligned with what I knew of my son's character or behavior. Stay here, I told Daniel, grabbing my car keys. I am going to speak with Sheriff Blackwood directly. The Pinewood Sheriff's Office occupied half of our town's municipal building, a brick structure dating back to the 1950s. Inside, a bored-looking deputy directed me to Sheriff Blackwood's office after I insisted the matter could not wait until Monday. Sheriff Sheila Blackwood sat behind an immaculate desk, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun that accentuated sharp cheekbones and calculating gray eyes. Two framed commendations hung on the wall behind her, alongside a large county map with colored pins marking what I presumed were areas of patrol concern. "Mr. Mitchell," she acknowledged without standing or offering her hand. "Deputy Carson says you have an urgent matter." "Sheriff Blackwood, my son Daniel received this warning today," I began, placing the citation on her desk. "I am concerned about the nature of the stop and the accusations listed here." She barely glanced at the paper. "Your son has been repeatedly observed in restricted areas surrounding municipal buildings. This represents a security concern." "My 12-year-old son on his bicycle is a security concern?" I asked, unable to hide my incredulity. Sheriff Blackwood's expression remained impassive. "We have implemented new protocols regarding civilian traffic patterns around government facilities. The north sidewalk where your son was riding today is considered a restricted lane during business hours." I looked around for any posted notice or map indicating such restrictions. I was unaware of any new traffic protocols. Is there public documentation I could review? "The measures were announced at last month's town council meeting," she replied coldly. "Perhaps you should attend if you wish to stay informed about community safety initiatives." Something about her tone, the dismissive certainty, the implied criticism, reminded me uncomfortably of a schoolyard bully masquerading as a hall monitor. "My son was simply riding his bicycle, Sheriff. He posed no threat to anyone." "Mr. Mitchell," she responded, standing to indicate our meeting was concluded, "I suggest you explain to your son that rules exist for everyone's protection. Next time, there will be consequences beyond a written warning. Good day." I left the station with more questions than answers and a growing sense of unease. That evening, as I walked home along Main Street, Eleanor Grayson, who owned the bookstore where Daniel spent countless hours, waved me over to her shop entrance. "Thomas," she said quietly once I was close enough that she could speak without being overheard, "I saw what happened with Daniel today. It is not the first time I have seen Sheila do something like that." "What do you mean?" I asked. Eleanor glanced around before continuing. "Sheila believes kids like Daniel are disruptive to order. Last month at the council meeting, she presented a proposal for designated youth movement corridors, basically restricting where young people could congregate or travel through town. The council voted it down, but—" she trailed off meaningfully. "But she is enforcing it anyway," I finished, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. Eleanor nodded. "Just be careful. Sheila does not respond well to having her authority questioned." That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I sat at my computer researching personal recording devices. By morning, I had ordered a small GoPro camera with extended battery life and memory capacity. When it arrived 3 days later, I mounted it discreetly to the underside of Daniel's bicycle seat, positioning it to capture interactions from behind. I told Daniel nothing about the camera. If Sheriff Blackwood was indeed targeting my son unfairly, I needed unfiltered evidence before making any accusations. The camera was small enough to go unnoticed during casual inspection, yet powerful enough to document any future encounters. As Daniel left for school the next morning, I watched him pedal away with a mixture of parental worry and quiet determination. If someone in power was harassing my child, they would no longer do so in the shadows. The first footage appeared innocuous, Daniel riding through suburban streets, waving to Mrs. Peterson as she watered her garden, stopping to let Mr. Rivera's dachshund sniff his shoelaces. Nothing that would interest anyone beyond a sentimental parent. But on the fourth day, the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. Daniel was pedaling along Sycamore Street, a residential road that eventually connected to Maine. The camera's angle showed the road behind him, including a white sheriff's department cruiser that pulled out from a side street and began following at a deliberate pace. For 6 blocks, Sheriff Blackwood maintained a distance of approximately 30 feet behind my son, never attempting to pass despite ample opportunity. The cruiser's presence was unmistakably intimidating, headlights on despite the afternoon sunshine, maintaining exact speed with a 12-year-old boy on a bicycle. Daniel glanced back several times, his pedaling becoming visibly faster with each look. Eventually, he turned down a neighborhood cul-de-sac where the cruiser did not follow. Only then did the sheriff accelerate and continue down Main Street. 2 days later, the camera documented a more direct confrontation. Daniel was riding along the edge of Veterans Park when the same cruiser pulled alongside him. Sheriff Blackwood's voice came clearly through the recording. "Pull over, son." Daniel immediately stopped, planting one foot on the ground as the sheriff exited her vehicle and approached. The camera captured her full uniform, including her hand resting casually on her holstered weapon, an unnecessary posture when addressing a child. "Where do you live?" she demanded, though I knew she had this information from our previous interaction. 214 Elm Street, ma'am," Daniel responded politely. "And who are your parents?" "Thomas Mitchell is my dad. It is just him and me." Sheriff Blackwood circled Daniel's bicycle slowly, inspecting it as if searching for violations. "You have been seen riding in this area frequently. What is your business here?" The absurdity of asking a child his business for riding a bicycle through a public park would have been comical if not for the intimidation evident in her tone. Daniel's voice became noticeably smaller. "I am just riding my bike home from school, Sheriff." "Through the park, every day, seems like an unnecessary detour." She leaned closer. "This park has had vandalism issues. We take suspicious patterns very seriously." "I am not doing anything wrong," Daniel said, his voice barely audible on the recording. "That is for me to determine," Sheriff Blackwood replied. "I suggest you find a more direct route home from now on. This park does not need daily visitors." She returned to her cruiser without issuing any formal warning, but the message was unmistakable. "You are being watched. You are not welcome here." That evening, Daniel asked if he could stay home the next day. When I questioned why, he admitted he had developed a stomach ache that grew worse each afternoon when school ended. The physician in me recognized the symptoms of anxiety. The father in me burned with quiet fury. As Daniel slept, I downloaded the footage from the GoPro onto my computer and began organizing the clips chronologically. I created a separate folder for each documented interaction, annotating them with dates, times, and locations. What emerged was not a series of random encounters, but a methodical pattern of intimidation, a campaign of soft harassment against a child whose only offense was enjoying the freedom his bicycle provided. Over the next week, I continued collecting footage. The encounters varied in intensity but shared a common theme. Sheriff Blackwood or her deputies would appear wherever Daniel rode, creating a climate of surveillance and apprehension. Some days, the cruiser would simply follow him. Other days, officers would question him about his route or destination. The effect was cumulative. Daniel began taking longer routes to avoid certain streets. He stopped visiting the library entirely. His once joyful after-school ritual became a source of visible stress. One particularly disturbing clip showed Daniel riding down Cedar Lane when Sheriff Blackwood's cruiser pulled directly into his path, forcing him to brake suddenly. She emerged and demanded to see the contents of his backpack, claiming she had received reports of a young person matching his description, behaving suspiciously. Daniel complied, emptying his school books, homework, and lunch container onto the sidewalk, while the sheriff watched with arms crossed. Finding nothing of interest, she departed without helping him collect his scattered possessions. After 3 weeks of documentation, I had compiled over 17 distinct interactions, none resulting in formal citations, all existing in that gray area of authority that left no paperwork trail, but achieved the desired effect of control and intimidation. One evening, I found Daniel standing beside his bicycle in the garage, staring at it with an expression I had never seen before. "I think I might just walk from now on, Dad," he said quietly. I knelt beside him, placing my hand on his shoulder. "You love riding your bike. Why would you stop?" His answer stripped away any remaining doubt about what was happening. "Because when I ride it, I feel like I am doing something wrong, even when I am not." That simple statement, the criminalization of childhood freedom, crystallized everything for me. This was no longer about misunderstandings or overzealous policing. Sheriff Blackwood had deliberately targeted my son, using her authority to systematically diminish his sense of belonging in his own community. As I added that day's footage to my growing archive, I realized this was bigger than control. It was about intimidation, about bending others to her will simply because she could. And if she was doing this to my son, she was almost certainly doing it to others. That night, I backed up all footage to an encrypted cloud account and began researching town council members who might be receptive to my concerns. Because this pattern could not continue, not for Daniel, and not for any other child who simply wanted to ride freely through the streets of their hometown. Councilwoman Rebecca Torres had built her reputation on education and youth advocacy. As a former school principal, she had championed after-school programs and community spaces for teenagers. If anyone on the town council would listen without immediate dismissal, it would be her. I requested a private meeting, careful to use my personal email rather than anything connected to my workplace. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop 2 towns over, her suggestion, not mine, which only heightened my growing sense that Sheriff Blackwood's influence cast a longer shadow than I had initially imagined. "I cannot stay long," Councilwoman Torres said by way of greeting, settling into the corner booth I had selected. "What was so urgent that we needed to meet outside Pinewood?" I placed my laptop on the table and opened the video folder. "I need you to see something happening in our town." For 20 minutes, Rebecca Torres watched silently as I played selected clips of Sheriff Blackwood's interactions with Daniel. Her expression remained neutral, but her knuckles whitened around her coffee cup as the pattern became undeniable. "Has your son been formally charged with anything?" she asked when the final clip ended. "No, and that is part of the problem. There is no paper trail, nothing official I can challenge. Just consistent intimidation that is affecting his mental health and freedom of movement." Councilwoman Torres closed my laptop gently. "This is bad, Thomas, but you need to be careful." "Careful of what? My son has done nothing wrong." Sheila Blackwood was elected with overwhelming support from the county commissioners and business council, she explained, lowering her voice. "She has portrayed herself as the solution to imaginary problems, and people desperate for simple answers have embraced her. Several council members have tried questioning her department's increased budget and aggressive patrol schedules, but we have been systematically sidelined." "Are you saying the town council cannot hold the sheriff accountable?" I asked incredulously. "I am saying that accountability requires political will, and right now, that will does not exist." She glanced toward the door before continuing. Sheila has cultivated powerful allies. Anyone who challenges her publicly tends to experience difficulties. I cannot just allow this to continue, I insisted. I did not say do nothing, Rebecca clarified. I said be careful, document everything, find others with similar experiences, build a case so overwhelming that even her supporters cannot ignore it. She stood to leave, then hesitated. And Thomas, prepare for pushback. It will come and it will not be subtle. Councilwoman Torr's warning proved prophetic sooner than I anticipated. 3 days after our meeting, I found an official citation tucked under my windshield wiper as I left work. The violation: improper vehicle positioning causing public obstruction. The location cited was my own driveway, where my truck had been parked in the same position for the past 4 years without incident. The following evening, a deputy I did not recognize knocked on my front door. Deputy Marshall, according to his nameplate, stood with thumbs hooked in his belt, rocking slightly on his heels. "Evening, Mr. Mitchell. Just following up on some community concerns." "What concerns?" I asked, remaining in the doorway rather than inviting him inside. "We have received reports about suspicious interest in department operations. Sheriff wanted me to check if you are having issues that need addressing." His tone was conversational, but the implied message was clear. "No issues," I replied evenly, "though I am curious what constitutes suspicious interest in public servants performing their duties." Deputy Marshall's friendly demeanor cooled noticeably. "Some folks seem intent on stirring up trouble where none exists. Sheriff Blackwood is concerned such activities might create unnecessary division in our community." "I appreciate the sheriff's concern for community harmony," I said, maintaining eye contact. "Please assure her that as a taxpayer and citizen, my only interest is in ensuring public offices operate with transparency and fairness." After the deputy departed, I called my landlord, Marcus Whitaker, to ask if he had received any communications regarding my rental. His uncomfortable silence confirmed my suspicions before he even spoke. "Someone from code enforcement called yesterday," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "They had concerns about occupancy regulations and whether your lease was properly documented. Never had that kind of inquiry in 15 years of renting properties." "And what prompted this sudden interest in my living arrangements?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They mentioned receiving an anonymous tip about potential violations. I told them everything was in order, but they suggested they might need to conduct an inspection." He paused. "Thomas, are you in some kind of trouble?" I assured Marcus everything was fine, while mentally adding this incident to the growing constellation of retaliatory actions. The message could not have been clearer: back off, or face escalating consequences. That night, I created a second backup of all video evidence and placed it in a safety deposit box at a bank in the neighboring county. I then began legal consultations, contacting 3 attorneys who specialized in civil rights and law enforcement accountability. 2 declined to meet after learning the case involved Sheriff Blackwood. The third, Catherine Alvarez from a firm 50 miles away, agreed to review my documentation. "This is textbook intimidation," Attorney Alvarez confirmed after examining the videos and timeline of events. "The problem is proving intent. Each individual interaction can be explained away as routine policing, even if the pattern reveals otherwise." "So there is nothing I can do?" I asked, frustration evident in my voice. "I did not say that," she replied, reminding me of Councilwoman Torr's. "I said proving intent is difficult, but patterns this clear eventually reveal themselves to others. You need more voices, more experiences. Is your son the only young person being targeted? Her question sparked a realization that should have been obvious from the beginning. Daniel could not be the only victim of Sheriff Blackwood's campaign against youth mobility. If this was truly about control and power, there would be others, perhaps many others, experiencing similar harassment. I created an anonymous email account that evening and composed a careful message. Has your child experienced unusual interactions with local law enforcement while engaging in normal activities like biking, walking, or gathering with friends in public spaces? I am gathering information about community policing practices and would appreciate hearing your experiences. All communications will remain strictly confidential. I sent this message to several parent groups and community forums, using a VPN to mask my location. Then I waited, uncertain whether fear would silence potential respondents or if my message would open floodgates of similar stories. What I did not expect was how quickly and decisively those floodgates would open, or how those stories would transform from isolated complaints into a movement that would shake the very foundation of Sheriff Blackwood's carefully constructed authority. My anonymous inquiry yielded results faster than anticipated. Within 48 hours, my dedicated email account received 17 messages from concerned parents and community members. Each shared stories with disturbing similarities to Daniel's experiences. Jennifer Wilcox described how her 14-year-old daughter was repeatedly questioned for suspicious loitering while waiting for friends outside the community center. Carlos Rodriguez recounted his 16-year-old son being cited for noise pollution when his skateboard wheels were deemed too loud near the county courthouse. Most alarming was Patrice Washington's account of her 15-year-old son having his mountain bicycle confiscated after allegedly riding too close to a police vehicle in the municipal parking lot. Despite multiple attempts to retrieve it, the bicycle remained impounded for evidentiary reasons, never specified in writing. I organized these testimonies chronologically, noting that the pattern of harassment had intensified following Sheriff Blackwood's failed proposal for youth movement corridors at the town council meeting. What emerged was a clear timeline. When denied the authority to legally restrict young people's movements through official channels, Sheriff Blackwood had implemented an unofficial campaign of intimidation and control. Two parents agreed to meet me privately, both expressing fear of retribution if their concerns became public. Michael Lawson, father of 13-year-old twins, brought records of 3 separate incidents where his sons were stopped while biking to baseball practice. They take a different route each time it happens, Michael explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. But somehow, a patrol car always finds them. Last week, the deputy told them that groups of juveniles riding together constituted gang-like activity that warranted monitoring. They are 13, wearing Little League uniforms, carrying baseball gloves. Sarah Thompson's daughter had stopped riding her bike entirely after being followed for 6 consecutive days. She asked me if she had done something wrong, if she was in trouble somehow. I could not explain to her why a grown woman with a badge and gun would intimidate a 12-year-old girl. What do you tell your child when the people meant to protect them become the source of their fear? What struck me most about these conversations was the isolation each family had felt, each believing their experience was unique, perhaps even deserved in some way they could not identify. Sheriff Blackwood had weaponized this isolation, ensuring that no single complaint would gain sufficient traction to challenge her authority. I expanded my outreach, creating a secure online form where community members could submit their experiences anonymously. To ensure authenticity, I requested specific details that only genuine interactions would contain: officer names, vehicle numbers, exact wording of verbal warnings. Within 2 weeks, I had compiled 57 distinct accounts spanning the 18 months of Sheriff Blackwood's tenure. The pattern was undeniable and deeply troubling. Sheriff Blackwood had systematically targeted the community's youngest members, focusing particularly on their mobility and gathering behaviors. Bicycles were a primary focus, representing both physical freedom and the ability to congregate without adult supervision. By controlling where and how young people could travel through Pinewood, she effectively controlled their access to public spaces and social connections. More disturbing was the demographic pattern that emerged. While white children from affluent families typically received verbal warnings, Hispanic and Black children were disproportionately issued written citations. Children from lower-income neighborhoods faced the highest rates of bicycle confiscation and formal charges for nebulous violations like unauthorized congregation and disruptive presence. I created a map marking each reported incident, color-coded by severity of interaction. The visual representation was startling: concentrated activity around civic buildings, parks, and the main library, all public spaces where young people had traditionally gathered. It was as if Sheriff Blackwood was systematically reclaiming these spaces, establishing invisible boundaries that communicated clearly: these areas belong to authority, not to youth. Several teenagers submitted accounts describing how deputies had taken their photographs for department records after stopping them for minor or invented infractions. One 16-year-old wrote, "They have my picture in their system now because I cut through the park after the basketball court closed. I didn't damage anything or make noise. I just existed in the wrong place." That phrase, "existed in the wrong place," encapsulated the fundamental injustice unfolding in our town. Sheriff Blackwood had effectively criminalized youth presence in public spaces, creating an environment where young people were presumed suspicious by default. One evening, as I updated my growing database of incidents, Daniel entered my home office and noticed the map open on my computer screen. "What are all those markers?" he asked. I considered deflecting the question to shield him from additional worry, but decided that honesty would ultimately be more empowering. "Those are places where other kids have been stopped by Sheriff Blackwood or her deputies, just like happened to you." Daniel stared at the screen, his expression moving from confusion to gradual understanding. "That is a lot of stops." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "So it was not just me," he said quietly, something like relief washing over his features. "I thought maybe I was doing something wrong without realizing it." His words crystallized my purpose more clearly than any legal principle or ethical abstraction could have done. This was about more than challenging an authority figure's abuse of power. It was about restoring my son's fundamental right to exist in public space without shame or fear, and by extension, the same right for every young person in Pinewood. The deeper I dug, the darker the pattern became. Parents reached out quietly, nervously. One told me her son had his bike taken and never got it back. Another said their daughter was warned not to ride past the sheriff's department for her own good. It was not random. Sheriff Blackwood was controlling movement, especially youth, fear disguised as safety. I created a burner email. "Tell me your story," I wrote. Within a week, I had 20 accounts of similar harassment. Each story reinforced what I already knew: silence was her weapon, and I was going to make it loud. Because the time had come to stop collecting and start broadcasting. To transform these isolated incidents into a compelling narrative that even Sheriff Blackwood's staunchest supporters could not ignore. The question was not whether to expose the pattern publicly, but how to do so in a way that would protect the vulnerable while demanding accountability from the powerful. It was time to shine light into shadows, not just for Daniel, but for every child who deserved to ride freely under the open sky of their hometown. With 57 documented incidents and 20 families willing to share their stories anonymously, I knew the time had come to transform these isolated experiences into a cohesive narrative that could not be ignored. Over a weekend, while Daniel stayed with his grandparents, I converted our dining room into an editing studio, spreading maps, timelines, and interview transcripts across the table. I titled the video simply, "Biking While Young, the Hidden Sheriff of Pinewood." No sensationalism, no dramatic claims, just a straightforward documentation of what was happening in our town. The opening sequence utilized the most powerful footage from Daniel's bike camera, Sheriff Blackwood's cruiser following just 30 feet behind him for 6 blocks, headlights blazing in broad daylight. I overlaid a simple map showing Daniel's route and the cruiser's parallel tracking. The message was unmistakable without requiring a single word of narration. From there, I structured the 12-minute video chronologically, beginning with Sheriff Blackwood's failed proposal for youth movement corridors at the town council meeting. Using public records and meeting minutes, I established the timeline of how her department had implemented through intimidation what she could not achieve through legitimate policy channels. For each segment documenting harassment, I included context, the child's age, the nature of their activity, and the officer's response. I anonymized the children's identities through simple blurring while ensuring Sheriff Blackwood's face and badge number remained clearly visible in every interaction. The video juxtaposed her campaign promises of community-oriented policing with the reality of her systematic targeting of the town's youngest residents. The most powerful segments featured audio testimonies from parents and children, their voices altered slightly to protect their identities, describing how these encounters had changed their relationship with public spaces and authority figures. I used to love riding my bike to the library. Now I take the bus even though it takes 3 times longer. A 14-year-old girl. My son asked me if he was a criminal because the sheriff kept stopping him. He is 11. A father whose voice broke mid-sentence. She told me kids like me were the reason they needed more police funding. A 15-year-old boy of color who had been stopped 4 times in 2 months. I concluded the video with a damning statistical analysis. A map showing the concentration of stops around public spaces traditionally frequented by young people, and data revealing the disproportionate targeting of minority and lower-income children. No editorializing was necessary. The pattern spoke for itself. The final frame displayed a simple question: is this who we want to be, Pinewood? I uploaded the video at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night through a secure connection, hosting it on 3 different platforms simultaneously to prevent easy takedown. I shared the links through anonymous accounts to local community groups, parent organizations, and several journalists who had previously covered stories about law enforcement accountability. By Monday afternoon, the video had 5,000 views. By Tuesday morning, 30,000. By Wednesday, it had surpassed 500,000 and been picked up by 3 state news outlets. My phone began ringing with calls from numbers I did not recognize, journalists seeking comment, parents wanting to share additional stories, community organizers looking to coordinate responses. I maintained my anonymity, communicating only through secure email and declining all interview requests. This was not about personal recognition or vendetta. It was about the systematic abuse of power that had been happening in plain sight but without collective awareness. Sheriff Blackwood's response came swiftly and predictably. At a hastily organized press conference, she stood flanked by 3 deputies and the mayor, her normally immaculate uniform somehow looking more theatrical than authoritative under the harsh camera lights. This heavily edited propaganda video misrepresents standard community safety protocols, she declared, her voice steady but her eyes darting occasionally to prepared notes. Our department maintains vigilant presence around civic buildings and public spaces to ensure the safety of all citizens, including our youth. Individual interactions have been taken out of context and manipulated to create a false narrative that undermines community safety. The local newspaper printed her statement in full, but alongside it ran images captured from the video showing her cruiser shadowing Daniel along an empty residential street. The visual contradiction of her words was stark and damning. When pressed by a reporter about specific incidents documented in the video, Sheriff Blackwood's composure momentarily cracked. These are routine stops based on suspicious behavioral patterns. The department has the right and responsibility to monitor unusual activity, particularly near sensitive public infrastructure. Is a 12-year-old on a bicycle unusual activity? The reporter countered. Context matters, Sheriff Blackwood replied tersely before ending the press conference. That evening, Daniel and I watched the local news coverage together. I had finally told him about the GoPro and my compilation of evidence, explaining that sometimes adults in authority needed to be held accountable just like children. "Are you worried about getting in trouble?" he asked as we watched Sheriff Blackwood's defensive press conference. I considered lying to protect him from worry, but opted for honesty. A little, but I am more worried about what happens if nobody speaks up when something is wrong. Daniel was quiet for a moment before saying something that crystallized everything this fight was about. She made me feel like I was doing something wrong just by riding my bike. But I was not the one doing something wrong, was I? No, I assured him, pulling him close. You were not, and now everyone can see that. As the week progressed, the story expanded beyond our local media. State news outlets picked it up, framing it within larger narratives about police overreach and community oversight. Social media amplified the video further, with parents from neighboring counties sharing similar experiences with their local law enforcement. The conversation had irrevocably shifted. What Sheriff Blackwood had dismissed as propaganda had become undeniable evidence of systematic harassment. Her voice, her face, her actions, those spoke for themselves. She had turned a quiet bike ride into a battleground, and now the whole state could see who was really out of line. The state attorney general's office contacted me through my anonymous email account 10 days after the video went viral. An aide to Assistant Attorney General Marcos, Vega requested a secure channel for communication regarding potential civil rights violations by law enforcement in Pinewood County. I complied, utilizing encrypted messaging to provide additional documentation while maintaining my anonymity. 2 days later, the office announced a formal inquiry into alleged patterns of youth harassment by the Pinewood Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Blackwood responded with a public statement welcoming the investigation as an opportunity to clear her department's good name from baseless accusations. The inquiry moved with surprising speed. Within a week, subpoenas were issued for department records related to all stops involving minors over the previous 18 months. Sheriff Blackwood was ordered to testify under oath before a special committee composed of state officials, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement standards representatives. I received a subpoena as well, identified only as the compiler of evidentiary video materials. After consultation with Attorney Alvarez, I agreed to testify while maintaining my anonymity from the general public. The committee granted this unusual request, given the documented pattern of retaliation against those who questioned Sheriff Blackwood's authority. The night before the hearing, I uploaded all raw, unedited footage from Daniel's bike camera to a secure server accessible to the committee members. With each clip meticulously labeled with dates, times, and GPS coordinates, the material made it impossible to sustain claims of manipulation or selective editing. This was not cherry-picked evidence. It was comprehensive documentation of a systemic problem. The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in a slightly sickly pallor. I entered through a side door, my identity shielded from media and spectators. Sheriff Blackwood sat at a table with her attorney, her posture rigid, uniform pristine. The contrast between her current composure and the aggressive intimidation captured on video was striking. Assistant Attorney General Vega opened the proceedings with a neutral statement about the purpose of the inquiry. What followed was 5 hours of methodical examination that stripped away Sheriff Blackwood's carefully constructed facade one question at a time. Sheriff Blackwood, can you explain the department policy regarding stops of minors in public spaces? Vega began. Standard community safety protocols, she responded, leaning slightly toward the microphone. Officers are trained to maintain awareness of all citizens utilizing public infrastructure, with particular attention to vulnerable populations including minors. And what specific training do officers receive regarding interaction with minors? De-escalation techniques, age-appropriate communication methods, and safeguarding procedures. Vega nodded, then displayed the first video clip on a large screen, a deputy following Daniel for several blocks. Would you characterize this interaction as utilizing de-escalation techniques or age-appropriate communication? Sheriff Blackwood's attorney interjected with objections about context and edited materials, but was silenced when Vega produced certification of the footage's chain of custody and technical verification of its authenticity. The questions continued, each one more specific than the last, each backed by irrefutable visual evidence. Why was a child questioned for riding a bicycle past public buildings? On what grounds were bikes confiscated without documentation? Why did stop rates increase dramatically after her failed proposal for youth movement corridors? Sheriff Blackwood's responses grew increasingly defensive, relying heavily on phrases like officer discretion and community safety concerns, without specific justification. Her carefully constructed narrative began unraveling under the weight of documented reality. The turning point came unexpectedly from within her own department. Deputy Lisa Martinez, a 3-year veteran of the force, requested to provide testimony. Looking directly at Sheriff Blackwood rather than the committee members, Deputy Martinez recounted a department meeting where specific instructions had been given. Sheriff Blackwood told us to keep the kids in check around public buildings, Deputy Martinez testified, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. She said loitering youth created a perception of disorder that undermined the department's authority. We were instructed to document all youth presence near county property and discourage regular patterns of movement through those areas. A second deputy, James Wilson, corroborated this account, adding that unofficial quotas existed for youth contacts, with officers being praised for maintaining order when they recorded higher numbers of stops. Sheriff Blackwood's face remained impassive throughout their testimony, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped the edge of the table. When given the opportunity to respond, she characterized the deputy's statements as misinterpretations of standard operational briefings, and questioned their motivations for undermining department cohesion. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the Ethics Board deliberated for less than 2 hours before issuing their decision: immediate suspension of Sheriff Blackwood pending full investigation of misconduct charges. The board cited substantial evidence of systematic targeting of minors without legitimate law enforcement purpose and misuse of authority resulting in civil rights concerns. I watched from a side room as Sheriff Blackwood walked from the building, no longer flanked by supportive deputies, her previously commanding presence diminished under the weight of accountability. She moved mechanically to her personal vehicle, not the department cruiser she had used to intimidate so many children, and drove away without speaking to the assembled media. That afternoon, Daniel rode his bicycle past the courthouse. I followed at a distance in my truck, watching with a mixture of apprehension and hope. No cruiser appeared to follow him. No officer emerged to question his presence. For the first time in months, he pedaled freely through public space without looking anxiously over his shoulder. What had started with a GoPro had ended in courtrooms. The woman who had wielded her badge as a weapon now found herself stripped of its protection. My son rode past the courthouse that afternoon, and this time no one followed. News of Sheriff Blackwood's suspension rippled through Pinewood like a stone dropped in still water. The initial reaction was stunned silence, followed by an outpouring of long-suppressed frustration. Parents who had remained quiet out of fear now spoke openly about their children's experiences. Teenagers shared their stories on social media under their real names rather than anonymous accounts. 3 days after the Ethics Board decision, a spontaneous gathering formed at the Civic Center. What began as a small group of concerned parents swelled into a community-wide demonstration. Hand-painted signs expressed months of pent-up indignation. Let our kids be kids. Bikes are not crimes. And most poignantly, let us ride. The protest remained peaceful but resolute. Families arrived on bicycles, creating a sea of wheels that symbolized the very freedom Sheriff Blackwood had tried to suppress. Children who had been afraid to ride in public now did so surrounded by supportive adults who understood what had been taken from them. Local officials, sensing the shifting political winds, addressed the crowd with promises of reform and accountability. The mayor, who had stood silently behind Sheriff Blackwood at her press conference just weeks earlier, now spoke of healing community divisions and restoring trust between citizens and law enforcement. Through it all, I maintained my public anonymity, observing from the periphery as the movement took on a life beyond my individual actions. This was no longer about Daniel and me. It had become about fundamental questions of power, freedom, and what kind of community Pinewood wanted to be. 2 weeks into the formal investigation, Sheriff Blackwood submitted her resignation, effective immediately. Her brief statement cited personal reasons and expressed hope that the department could move forward without distraction. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of harm caused, just a tactical retreat designed to avoid further scrutiny and potential criminal charges. Her resignation might have been the end of the story in previous times, a quiet departure that allowed wounds to scab over without proper healing. But Pinewood had changed. The town council unanimously passed a resolution calling for a complete review of all departmental policies regarding interactions with minors. The county commissioners established a civilian oversight committee with actual enforcement powers rather than merely advisory capacity. The interim sheriff, a 30-year veteran named Robert Gaines who had been passed over when Blackwood was appointed, made community reconciliation his first priority. He organized a town hall meeting specifically for young people to express their concerns and experiences without fear of reprisal. Law enforcement exists to protect all citizens, regardless of age, Sheriff Gaines stated, looking directly at the young people gathered in the community center. A badge is a symbol of public trust, not a license for control. I want to hear from you not just what went wrong, but how we can make it right. Daniel attended that meeting, initially hesitant to speak. But as other children shared their stories, the constant stopping, the intimidation, the feeling of being unwelcome in their own town, he found his courage. When his turn came, he walked to the microphone, his small frame tense with nervousness. "My name is Daniel Mitchell," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "For months, I was afraid to ride my bike because I felt like I was doing something wrong just by being outside. I started taking longer routes home. I stopped going to the library. I even asked my dad if I could walk instead of ride, even though riding was my favorite thing." He paused, gathering himself before continuing with growing confidence. "But I did not do anything wrong. None of us did. We are not threats. We are neighbors. We are kids who just want to ride our bikes and feel safe in our own town." The room fell silent when he finished, then erupted in supportive applause. I watched from the back row, my heart swelling with a complex mixture of pride, vindication, and healing. My son had found his voice, not just for himself but for every child who had been made to feel like an intruder in public space. As the meeting concluded, Sheriff Gaines approached Daniel and extended his hand. "Thank you for your honesty, son. Sometimes it takes the youngest voices to remind us of the most important truths." That night, Daniel slept peacefully for the first time in months without his now familiar pre-bedtime anxiety. As I checked on him before turning in myself, I reflected on how thoroughly our community had been transformed by challenging a single abuse of power. We had not just exposed a problem, we had rebuilt a town. Meaningful change rarely happens overnight, but Pinewood moved with surprising determination to address the systemic issues exposed by Sheriff Blackwood's actions. The town council's first formal act under the new administration was to unanimously adopt the Youth Transportation Protection Act, a comprehensive set of guidelines explicitly prohibiting law enforcement from stopping or questioning minors without specific, documented cause. The ordinance required officers to activate body cameras for all interactions with individuals under 18, with footage to be reviewed monthly by the newly established Civilian Oversight Committee. It prohibited confiscation of bicycles, skateboards, or other transportation devices, except in cases involving clear safety violations, and even then, required parental notification within 1 hour. Most significantly, the ordinance established youth transit corridors, the exact opposite of Blackwood's restricted zones, designating key routes through town, where young people were explicitly protected from unwarranted stops while traveling to schools, parks, and libraries. "We are not just correcting past mistakes," Councilwoman Torres declared during the signing ceremony. "We are affirming positive rights, the right of our young citizens to move freely through public space without fear of harassment or intimidation." The business community, initially hesitant to involve themselves in what some viewed as a political controversy, eventually recognized the importance of healing community divisions. The local bicycle shop owner, Martin Reeves, partnered with several other businesses to establish a fund for free bike safety training and helmet distribution. For decades, kids on bikes have been the heartbeat of small-town America, Martin said at the program launch. "We lost sight of that for a while in Pinewood. This is our way of helping restore what should never have been taken away." The first safety class drew over 60 participants ranging from 5-year-olds on training wheels to teenagers on mountain bikes. Volunteer instructors included 3 deputies from the sheriff's department, a visible symbol of the department's commitment to rebuilding trust with the community's youngest members. My involvement in these changes deepened when Sheriff Gaines asked me to join a civilian advisory board for public safety reform. I hesitated initially, uncertain whether stepping into a public role would be helpful or merely self-aggrandizing. After discussing it with Daniel, I accepted the position with the understanding that my focus would remain on youth safety and community relations rather than broader law enforcement policy. "You showed me it is important to speak up," Daniel said when I asked for his opinion on accepting the role. "Maybe now you should speak up where more people can hear you." My first recommendation as an advisory board member was the implementation of Know Your Rights education in local schools, teaching young people about their constitutional protections in age-appropriate ways, while also emphasizing responsible citizenship. The program received unanimous approval from both the school board and the sheriff's department, a cooperation that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. 6 months after Sheriff Blackwood's resignation, the physical landscape of Pinewood began reflecting its philosophical transformation. The stark, "No loitering" signs that had proliferated under her administration were replaced with new signage reading "Public Space for All Citizens." The alleyway behind the municipal buildings, where Daniel's ordeal had begun, was redesignated as a community passage with improved lighting and bicycle-friendly features. On a warm Saturday morning in early autumn, Daniel and I decided to ride together through town, following the route that had once been the source of so much anxiety and conflict. We pedaled side by side down Main Street, past the courthouse and sheriff's department, and turned into the alley that had been the epicenter of tension. The passage was transformed, not just physically with its new signage and bike lanes, but energetically. Several other cyclists passed us going the opposite direction, including a deputy who nodded pleasantly as we passed. Neighbors waved from porches and storefronts. What had once been a gauntlet of intimidation had become simply what it should have always been, a public thoroughfare connecting one part of our community to another. "It feels different," Daniel observed as we emerged onto Cedar Street. "The road?" I asked. "Everything," he replied thoughtfully. "It feels like people are happy to see us riding instead of worried about it." That observation captured what had fundamentally changed in Pinewood. The physical spaces remained the same, but the social contract governing those spaces had been rewritten. Our community had not just reformed policies but reclaimed the very concept of public space, who it belonged to and how it could be used. As we completed our loop through town, Deputy Martinez drove past in her patrol car, slowing beside us not to intimidate but to comment on the beautiful weather for riding. The interaction lasted less than 15 seconds, but its normalcy represented months of healing and restoration. The road felt open, felt right, because we did not just fix a system, we reminded it what it was meant to be. Spring arrived in Pinewood with an explosion of color and activity. The town park, once patrolled with suspicious vigilance under Sheriff Blackwood's administration, now bustled with life as families reclaimed public spaces. Most noticeable was the return of children on bicycles, no longer riding furtively or taking circuitous routes to avoid scrutiny, but moving freely through town with the unself-conscious joy that childhood deserves. Daniel had undergone his own transformation during these months. The nervous boy who had once asked to abandon his beloved bicycle had not only resumed riding, but had developed new confidence and purpose. When advertisements appeared for Pinewood's first youth cycling event, a non-competitive freedom ride followed by age-grouped races. Daniel announced he wanted to participate in the 12 to 14 category race. "Are you sure?" I asked, surprised by his interest in competitive riding. "You have never raced before." "I have been practicing," he replied with newfound determination, "and I am not scared anymore." The morning of the race dawned clear and mild. The town square had been transformed into an event space with a starting line, viewing areas, and local vendors offering refreshments. What struck me most powerfully was the atmosphere, the absence of tension, the natural interaction between deputies directing traffic and children assembling with their bicycles. Daniel arrived at the starting area early, wearing a new helmet we had purchased for the occasion. His blue Schwinn had been meticulously cleaned and tuned, its frame gleaming in the morning light. He seemed simultaneously nervous and exhilarated as he took his position among 20 other young riders. Sheriff Gaines himself fired the starting pistol. The racers surged forward in a blur of motion and color, their route taking them along Main Street, through Veterans Park, past the municipal buildings, including the sheriff's department, and back to the town square, a circuit that deliberately incorporated all the spaces that had once been sites of intimidation and control. Daniel did not win the race. He finished 12th out of 22 participants, pedaling across the finish line with burning lungs and trembling legs, but an unmistakable expression of triumph. The victory was not about placement but about reclamation, of space, of freedom, of security in his own community. "I was not even looking at who was ahead of me," he confided later. "I just kept thinking about how good it felt to ride as fast as I could without worrying about who might be watching or following." That summer brought other symbols of Pinewood's transformation. A local artist volunteered to paint a mural on the previously blank wall facing the community center's parking lot. The design, developed with input from local children, depicted young people on bicycles, skateboards, and scooters moving through a stylized version of the town. There were no shadows looming behind them, no suggestion of surveillance or suspicion, just the unfettered movement of youth through welcoming public space. The unveiling ceremony attracted hundreds of residents. Standing before the freshly completed artwork, Mayor Wilson spoke of visual reminders of our community values and representations of the freedom we promise to all citizens, regardless of age. When the artist invited children to press their painted handprints along the mural's border, Daniel was among the first to step forward, leaving his mark in bright blue, the color of his bicycle, the color of open sky. Despite these positive changes, I maintained certain precautions. The original GoPro footage remained backed up in multiple locations, including a fire-safe box in my home office, not out of lingering fear or desire for revenge, but as historical documentation of how quickly rights can be eroded when power operates without accountability. Some memories should be preserved not to perpetuate grievance, but to prevent repetition. On the anniversary of the first incident, when Daniel had come home shaken after being stopped in the alley, we took a deliberate ride through town, retracing the exact route that had once caused such anxiety. As we pedaled side by side, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events a simple bike ride had initiated. "Do you ever think about Sheriff Blackwood?" Daniel asked unexpectedly as we approached the alleyway. "Sometimes," I admitted. Not with anger anymore, though, more with a sense of perspective about how important it is to question authority when necessary. Daniel considered this as we turned into the community passage. "I am glad you taught me to stand up for what is right, even when the person doing wrong has a badge." That moment crystallized everything I had hoped to impart to my son through this difficult journey. Sometimes the smallest things reveal the biggest truths. A sidewalk, A cruiser, a scared kid, a protective father, and a badge that forgot its purpose. She tried to police your path, I observed as we emerged onto Main Street, the afternoon sun warm on our shoulders. Daniel smiled, pedaling slightly ahead of me with the easy confidence that had been restored to him. But instead, I showed her what it means to move forward. As he accelerated away from me, back straight and head high, I watched my son ride past fear, straight into freedom. A freedom that now belonged not just to him, but to every young person in a town that had remembered its better self.